Aloha and welcome to Finding Our Futures. I'm John Sweeney. I am not in Hawaii this week, as you can see. I'm actually back home visiting some family on a route that brought me to Chicago for some meetings about some future stuff, which you'll hear about in future shows. But for today, I'm very excited to have two very interesting guests. Sandjar Kozubaev is a futurist working currently with In Reality. He's based in Atlanta, but just like 2 weeks ago in Russia, we are not in the same room at the same place at the same time. And Ali H. Musleh, who is a MA student in the same program as me at the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. Ali is Jordanian and Palestinian, and he's worked in San Francisco, the startup scene, and both of them actually have design degrees from the California College of Arts, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But the whole sort of purpose and the idea of today's show was to talk about very interesting sort of trains of thought that are currently intersecting in the foresight field. And that is the emphasis on design. There's been a push towards using design thinking in futures. And so really today we just want to explore design and foresight, what foresight can do for design and what design can do for foresight. So Ali and Sandjar, thanks for piping in today through the interwebs.
Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so I just want to start off, just sort of basic general. Can you guys talk a little bit about how design is currently working with futures? Maybe even more general and basic. What do you see as being meant when someone says design? And then how does that fit into the work that you do? So Sandjar, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Ali.
So I think when we talk about design, there's so-called design, the way at least I see it, the design big D and design small d. And the design small d is something that we're kind of accustomed to seeing. I'm getting feedback.
Yeah, sorry, we're getting a little bit of noise. I'm not sure.
Yes, we have other guests.
Guys here. I think we're getting a little bit of background noise. So, mic off. So I think we're hearing Jay Fidel right now, currently doing what he. Let's see. Let's give it just a second. Okay, Sandjar, I think we're clear. So, do us a favor and let's start over.
Okay, so when we talk about design, I think about it in two dimensions. There's design, what I call design big D, and design small d. Design small d is what most people associate design with, and that's kind of the visual expression or the output of design. Whether it's graphic design, whether it's specs on what we see on the computer, layouts, colors, like that. And then design with D is the philosophy or the methodology that is applied to solve problems in a certain way. And they have a few really common tenets, one of them being user-centric, the other one, in other words, trying to really understand the user need from a human need perspective. There's visual communication, there's storytelling, there's also rapid prototyping, in other words, testing your ideas with materials that you have at hand that are easy to come by. And these are some of the many things that combine to really define the approach of design. And that's what most people mean when they say design thinking. It's really the approach to solving problems in a way a designer would.
Very interesting. Yeah, and as you're saying, like the idea of design thinking has certainly a lot of cachet now, and people are very into it and sort of taking it. So let's turn to Ali. Ali, is it you have a similar impression? I know both you guys went to the same program, so just in general, like what you see as being the idea of design and how it's being used in a contemporary sense.
Generally speaking, when we talk about design thinking, we think about it in the context of business. And it's mainly thought of in terms of, problem solving. And there are plenty of interesting things that go into that process, but my general interest in what is design thinking basically goes beyond or out of that context into different contexts. I think that generally the design space is expanding to different areas and we need to think of design in governance in different areas, and basically try to sort of disconnect thought for a little bit from design to rethink basically the space of possibilities of design, right? I mean, I was just studying this example from Syria. The rebels there built this sort of Mad Max type DIY tank, right? And it is a design, but you have to think about it outside of that context. It's sort of processes of self-organization where different people, scrap yards, even PlayStation consoles go into that process. Actually, the tank is operated by a PlayStation controller.
Right.
So I tend to think more in that space now, just because sort of going into futures, you start thinking about the futures of design, but from a design perspective, sort of coming from the design MBA, you think of how design creates futures. So I'm in between, I guess.
Well, it's really interesting to hear that sort of, I don't even want to say a bridge or a divide, but, with Sandjar was talking about the user need. Citizens are users, right? And we oftentimes don't make that clear connection, but clearly with the work that both of you are doing, it extends beyond that, right? The world itself as user, right? And thinking about critical needs, right? And obviously the Syrian example is an extreme example of what you can do, right? If the times require it, but then also the foresight component, right? So maybe just again, Sandjar, we'll throw us back to you. How do you see then design and futures in a contemporary sense coming together, and what do you see as being sort of the fruit of that marriage?
Yeah, I think it's kind of continuing the theme that you guys alluded to. Thinking of users and systems and the users of those systems from both the designer's perspective and from futures perspective, I think is where really these two fields can make a big impact. Sort of coming from an economist, I'm a classically trained economist, so economists usually solve problems by modeling human behavior, using certain assumptions, some of which are effective, some of which don't. But design is really good at challenging yourself as a designer and the community at large, whether those assumptions are even there or accurate. So design is really good at saying, okay, we're completely ignorant about what it is that's causing this problem that we're challenged to solve. And from an economist's perspective, that's completely the opposite. A lot of times, a good designer will tell you, customers don't really know what they want. So you start kind of uncovering and peeling it back, you ask questions, and there's a whole body of knowledge of how to really conduct design research and ethnographic research, and that really helps to uncover the angle at which you need to attack the problem. Where futures really comes in is trying to imagine these big structures within which a society can exist in the future. So I see futures as thinking in 10-decade-long cycles, 20, 30, 50 years, where design is oscillates a little bit more. Right. So together they kind of really complement each other, I think. And then the other aspect that I think is what makes this space of design and futures really interesting is experience design. Our program, the MBA in Design Strategy at California College of the Arts, really puts experience design at the core of solving a problem in an effective way. If you look about, talking about civil society, if you think from a design thinking perspective, how would you design an experience of political participation rather than saying, how do you just vote? Voting is just one mechanism. What are other experiences could we design that could change the way citizens participate in the political process? So I think those kind of elements is what make the intersection of design and futures really interesting.
Cool, very cool, interesting. Okay, Ali, straight to you.
Generally speaking, when we talk about the relationship between design and futures, I tend to think about those structures that are happening around us. in terms of economy, environment, and all these things. They're pushing us to think more, to extend the horizon of design, right? To think more about future generations. So you instantly have this focus where you have to study, right? 10, 20, 30 years into the future, try to explore, and basically try to design something, right? You need to respond to create something. So generally, I feel that the problems are pushing us to think beyond, 2 to 3 years, as we usually do in product design, for example, or even 5 to 6. But I think that there's another interesting relationship that is, it's not necessarily about how to create preferred futures, but actually, we sometimes, for example, use design to communicate images of the future, right? For people to experience images that we generate from our futures research. So you see design here not as a problem-solving process, but something that pushes people to think critically about things. It tries to also push them to hopefully think creatively about problems. At the same time, in the last month, for example, we had we had to work on this project. It was really difficult to work in teams, to do futures research. It's always difficult. You're always thinking about these big things. So we used design in that project to sort of create a forum, right? A forum for futures research. And we were successful. We were able to work as a team, which is really hard when you're doing futures research. So you see design relationship with futures, on different levels and different areas.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Putting these two things together, I'm reminded of the aphorism that, I guess is attributed to Henry Ford, but apparently he didn't say it. And, the famous saying that if I'd asked people what they wanted, right, they would have said faster horses. So oftentimes, and from hearing you both speak, that design, obviously, there's an enormous ethical and political responsibility that it goes in, right? You're literally helping to create the world for subjects whose let's say needs, wants, desires we don't know, but yet we manufacture, right? And we actually produce. So maybe Ali, we'll stay with you, and then we'll go to Sandjar quickly before we have to break. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this sort of ethical, political component of that, right? Is it the case that design or foresight and design takes that seriously or into consideration? Do you think it's being done adequately? And that's a big question, but how do you see yourself approaching that? And then maybe how do you see that playing out in the field?
Yeah, difficult question. It's you definitely, as a designer, try to think of how you participate, right, in creating change. And this mixture of design and futures makes you think, or take with a grain of salt the intentions of the designer. Right? We design things, but things do not necessarily do what we intend them to do. So as you're trying to work, right, and create change, you have to try and be intentional somehow. But at the same time, you always see how design can create change and has influence beyond, right? It cascades into different systems. So I think in terms of what is ethical design? I don't necessarily know, but I think that we have to be aware of sort of the creativity of design, right? Its influence. Become more aware of it, try to understand it better beyond the intentions of the designer, right? To at least be aware of how we participate.
Interesting. Okay, Sandjar, over to you. Same question.
I think, one thing we need to kind of be mindful of is that even though design is a kind of a clearly defined profession with these kind of outshoots, there's a great movie called Design and Thinking, great documentary about these kinds of issues. And the point of that movie is that, a lot of professions and a lot of human activities are inherently, designer-like. We are designers inherently by the way we think, the way we act. What I think design, the strictly defined version of design is different, is that it's a little bit more expressive. In other words, it borders a little bit more on with art rather than say a scientific researcher, a chemist, for example. He could be a designer as well. So because it's so expressive, it kind of strives to be beautiful. It strives to express beauty into this world, and that's where I think there's an opportunity to be more ethical and to affect change in a more meaningful and long-lasting way.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. We're going to take a short break. I'm John A. Sweeney. This is Finding Our Futures. We are on Think Tech Live. My apologies for the technical difficulties to start off with, but hey, we're living in the future, so we seem to have designed our way around it and found a solution. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in a bit with Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh, both designers, both futurists, and fascinating people to talk to. So stick with us. We'll be back in a bit.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel, founder of Think Tech Hawaii. We are a digital media nonprofit that covers things that matter to tech, energy, diversification, globalism, and progress for our state, the state of Hawaii. We broadcast on community television and on Oceanic Cable Channel 16. We also stream our shows and interviews live on the internet as both radio and video, and of course we post them here on YouTube. We collaborate with the Hawaii Venture Capital Association to present monthly luncheon programs on subjects of interest to the business community, and we write for the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Think Tech works hard to raise public awareness in Hawaii. Check out our website, thinktechhawaii.com, and come to our YouTube channel, Think Tech Hawaii. We hope you support our mission and that you like our work. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Aloha and welcome back to Finding Our Futures. I am John A. Sweeney. Today we are joined by Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh. Both of them have MBAs in design strategy from the California College of Arts. And so we've been talking about their work as futurists, as designers, and the intersection between the two. So fascinating conversation about how the current sort of movement in futures is to articulate design, to integrate prototyping, to obviously generate artifacts. Many of these things have been happening in many ways and shapes and forms in the, quote, Manoa School for many years, but now we're starting to see it sort of diffuse broadly within the field. So Ali, I wanted to talk to you about your decision after having done the MBA in Design Strategy to come to Hawaii and to actually then enter the MA program in Future Studies. And then as, well, I try to talk you out of it, but to go on and to get a PhD in Future Studies as well. So could you talk about your experience in the program, a little bit about what the program is, and again, the MBA at the California College of Arts, and then we'll hear a bit from Sandjar.
Sure. I think what's interesting is what got me there. I worked in with a group of architects and designers in Jordan to basically try and advance design, right? We were bored of those commissioned projects that we used to work on, and they're basically sort of, you put a package around something, and that got too boring. And I wanted to think about the influence of design on business beyond just this package. So the DMBA was so appealing. And in 2008, I think they started the program, and I joined them in 2010. But I was aware of what they were doing since the beginning. And so working there, you start thinking about design in the wider business context, right? You think not only of the product, you think of a value proposition. You think of the business model that's wrapped around it. You think about strategy. And what's more interesting about it is that it develops this entrepreneurial designer type, right? You start working on projects and working with all the uncertainty that you have to deal with in a startup environment, but really see how your skills as a designer go into play into this process and really help advance a startup until to the point where it reaches sort of like Steve Blank says, a scalable, repeatable business model.
Okay, interesting. So you're coming to this program, or you came to that program specifically looking as to how design can continue to inform the sort of startup genre, if we want to call it that, right? The sort of movement towards entrepreneurialism and how that integrates with design. So Sandjar, what about you? How did you end up in the MBA in design strategy at the CCA?
As I mentioned before, I'm a classically trained economist, and I was doing economic consulting at large consultancies at the time. And I started reading a lot about kind of the future of work, and also trying to find a little more creative outlet for my work. And design started kind of unraveling, especially at the time in the Silicon Valley. You hear about designer CEOs, designer founders. So design and design thinking naturally came as one of the areas that I need to look into. And so it so happened that MBA in design strategy had just started out in San Francisco, and it was a no-brainer for me. I didn't apply anywhere else. I didn't want any other experience, any other regular business degree, especially coming from a consulting background. A regular MBA wouldn't just do anything for me because I had the exposure. So it was a very natural fit. Being in San Francisco, this program starting out, we were Ali and I were the third graduates of the program, so it was quite young at the time. So for me, and for many other students, it was a sort of a startup experience. It's a way to start up yourself from scratch, because the program was largely unproven. The methodology is largely unproven, i.e. the methodology of teaching business leadership in an art and design school. That was fairly unproven at the time. So I kind of took the risk, and I really believed in the methodology, and I really feel that there is a need to create a new institution, a new way of conducting business that doesn't destroy our environment, that doesn't create inequality, and it doesn't create all those other social and environmental problems. And I think DMBA is at the forefront of doing that, and I wanted to be part of that.
That's cool. There's that ethical and political component, right? Coming
Absolutely.
into it again, right? So it is gearing towards building a preferred future. So Sandjar, you were exposed to futures, and I don't mean that in the negative sort of viral sense, but in some ways I actually do, right? So how did futures work in that program, and how was foresight included as part of the design strategy MBA?
Just maybe I'll tell a little bit about the curriculum of the MBA program. So the MBA program is an MBA program. It's a business-focused program, so that means it does have all the accounting and economics and finance as any other business program should have. But the core of what you're learning is the design-driven innovation methods, and that really permeates through all of the other classes like marketing. We have Innovation Studio. We have other classes that really teach you how to uncover those user needs and then translate them into opportunities. And also, there are quite a few electives that you can take depending on what you're interested in, including entrepreneurship. You could take brand strategy, and one of the electives was strategic foresight and tactical media, as it was known back then, taught by Jack Donegan and Stuart Candy, who are PhDs from the Manoa School. And so that, it was very interesting right from the start. I got hooked since the first time I heard about the course. And the reason it worked really well and was powerful for me is because that experience design component, which I mentioned before, permeates all classes. It worked into foresight as well. So throughout the class, not only were we learning the content and the methodology of all the different future schools, we actually created tactical media interventions around the city, and some of them were really, really powerful, and some of my favorite futures work that I've seen before or since. So for us, creating experiences that expose possible futures, create new opportunities for new conversations, and create tangible artifacts is really what I think is powerful and effective in futures/design conversations.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Obviously, Jake and Stuart, their work has been amazing and they've been very influential. They were sort of the generation before me, and seeing the immensity of what they were able to do. And they're obviously, good friends and do really interesting stuff still. So it's good to hear that sort of the Manoa School has been diffused. So Sandjar, can you give an example of one of the projects, the tactical media interventions, the sort of artifact design, sort of something you saw that really or
Sure, yeah. So, we had so many really good ones. So the ones I personally worked on, we tackled the idea of intellectual IP ownership, specifically for users of digital media or in digital services like Google Plus or Gmail or all of these, or Google Docs. So we created a world in which Google was celebrating its 30th anniversary. So we created this campaign with posters and social media campaign, really celebrating all the different things that Google is able to do in 30 years. We actually chose a specific birthday on which Google was founded, so it was a real birthday. And we also created this timeline of different legislative acts that slowly but surely chipped away from people's claim to what they own in the digital media. So that was kind of a scenario that we employed. A lot of these things are already happening. We just imagined what would happen if the future continued, and we would literally sign off all of our ideas and creative output as soon as we log on and use these kinds of services. So these kinds of conversations are trying to ask questions to users and society at large as to what are you really willing to give up in that particular case in terms of your civil liberties and your creative output. And that's how I think Futures in Design is so effective and powerful in posing those questions in a very visual, expressive, tangible way.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning, the idea of experience design is taking something that people sometimes are familiar with or that seems digestible or plausible, and then tweaking it just a little bit such that it becomes, again, a place of pure potentiality, a pure possibility. And we certainly live at a time where, hey, if you're getting it for free, you're not the customer, you're the product being sold. So definitely some interesting stuff to think about. Ali, what was one of the projects there that spoke to you that you had a chance to see or work on?
I think my graduation project, the one we worked on in the venture studio, backing up to the strategic foresight class, it allowed us to basically have discussions that we wouldn't have had otherwise, right? And it just somehow you find politics coming in, right? It becomes part of the conversation, and sometimes designers don't do that often. Many do, but it was definitely a great experience, especially since by that time the Arab revolutions began. And it was very exciting. And basically, like all huge political events, they just seize you, right? You start thinking about them all the time, and you're worried about, your friends in those different countries and what's happening, and you just want to see things moving forward. So the strategic foresight class really helped me try and think about them in a productive way, right? Putting in this futures component and design component, bringing them together and try to work on something. And this is what we tried to do. We tried to build this platform that tries to bring in all those projects that are happening in the Arab world in that time to help them organize in that pan-Arab scene. Because when the revolutions began, we saw so many connections, especially between the youth, right? And we felt that since a lot of things are happening and people are responding in different countries, like for example, something happens in Tunisia, people respond in Egypt. Something happens in Syria, people respond in Jordan, right? So we wanted to use the internet to create this pan-Arab space because the Arab League sort of the official body that tries to represent those people is sort of a product of all those regimes. So we wanted to create the Arab League of Peoples, sort of. And this was the idea for the platform. And I think the strategic foresight class led me to that.
Nice. That's very cool. Yeah, that, thinking about that, the course of events specifically, and I know there were huge design challenges in places like Egypt, right, where the government shuts down the internet. And so a lot of firms were interested in how do we navigate around, right? So again, thinking about design and how can design fit into thinking about 21st century challenges and opportunities, it's really right there at the cusp, right? It really is the space where we can actually, and it sounds so cliche, and I hate to say it, but I'm going to make myself say it, get out of the box, right? And I'm actually in a box, you can see right now, right? Yeah, get out of this box and hopefully work towards a better space, again, immediately, but then also obviously long term. Okay, so we're going to have to take another short break. I'm John A. Sweeney. This is Finding Our Futures. You're watching Think Tech Live. I'm having the immense pleasure of chatting with Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh. So stick with us. We'll take a short break. We'll be back in a bit.
I'm Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with Think Tech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
Fascinating conversation with Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh. Both of them are designers. Both of them are futurists. They've been through the Design Strategy MBA program from the California College of Arts. And they're both interested in looking at the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, how the intersection of user-driven, citizen-driven, what's called experience design can leverage, but also be leveraged by futures thinking and hopefully make the world a better place. So Sandjar, you're actually doing this right now in your position as a sort of innovation consultant, experience strategist, educator, designer. You are, in fact, the strategy practice lead at In Reality. So could you talk about who In Reality is, what they do, and sort of what your day-to-day is like, and how you integrate futures and design into your work?
Sure. So we're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we help brands create experiences that connect their users to the brand. So a lot of the times, these are experiences that are in commercial environment, in like retail. It could be a digital experience, it could be an analog experience. And my role is, as the lead of the strategy practice, is to conduct research, lead multi-stakeholder conversations that actually try to articulate what that future experience should be, and connect the business goals, the brand strategy goals, as well as the user goals together, and then hopefully take those insights and translate it into a design objective. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. The way futures works in my day-to-day work is that I try to uncover possibilities for the company, that our clients, with the kind of the central tenet of futures, meaning that there is no one future. You're going to have to look at multiple possibilities. And a lot of times it's not a very intuitive thing to do. So for designers, it's very intuitive. But even throughout the design process, for example, you usually see, 3 or 4 what they call concepts, right? What we call concepts. So here's concept A, concept B, concept C. They're very, very different. They accomplish sort of the same thing, the same vision. They're very different in terms of their form and function. So what I try to do is, at the very beginning of the conversation, try to articulate or try to glean some of these insights to show our clients how the world could be, what kind of different futures the world could be that could satisfy the needs of their users, thereby leading to more commercial success. And then the other side of it is using futures and the power of the futures tools internally to develop our own practices. So we've actually done a few workshops in our different practices. We have the strategy practice, design practice, some other practices, to really figure out how are we going to organizationally grow that particular practice. And one of the notions that really was really useful to our colleagues and stakeholders is the idea of the preferable future, the future that you are likely to see, the likely future, et cetera, right? So what are the present future? What are the different futures that we could think of in this map of possibilities, and where do we think are likely to end up, and what is plausible for us to achieve? So that kind of language and that lexicon of futures was very new to our organization, and I think it kind of created a new awareness of the fact that there is this organizational weight that can pull you one way, even though you're trying to achieve this other objective, and being prepared for all of those scenarios, psychologically, organizationally, and in other ways, is a key insight and a key capability that we're trying to develop.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think that my sort of little experience with that sort of the corporate business client perspective is it's really hard to get someone on that end to take collapse seriously, right? To really consider the complete panoply of futures, right? And it's not to say that it, again, is the most likely or the most possible, but to think about the plurality of futures and to take that seriously and to place it on a horizontal axis and to think critically about what does our institution, what does our organization, what does our practice, our business look like in these different worlds, right? And how across that can we contribute to more egalitarian and more a just sort of space? So that's interesting. It's really cool stuff. All right, Ali. So I am much more familiar with your work, being that you've been around Hawaii for a couple of years, right? We've had a chance to rub elbows. So I want to hear you talk about some of the things that I don't know about. You don't have to let out any secrets. But then I also want you to talk about your experience with the Governance Design Lab, because I know you played a big part in the Honolulu node. So just talk about, again, your work, futures, design. What do you sort of have cooking, and what are you working on?
Okay, so there's this project that I'm trying to prepare for. It's in Jordan, and basically when the Syrian revolution more specifically began, you started seeing all those refugees coming into Jordan, and according to numbers, we have more than 500,000 of them in refugee camps. I think it's more than 600,000 now. And at the same time, we have a huge number of Syrians that are not necessarily refugees. They came into the borders through different channels, the airport and the borders. According to numbers, Syrians might reach about 40% of the Jordanian population. Wow. So when you think about these numbers, this country is sort of disrupted, right?
Right.
And before the revolutions, the borders weren't, they were more sharp, right? Jordan and Syria, two distinct states. Now the borders are way more fuzzy. We're very connected to them now in terms of security, population, economy, politics. So how does this Jordan function, right, as a state? So we, along with a few people who are interested in this project, trying to think about the different scenarios, right? Collapse, by the way, for example, here is something that you have to deal with every day.
Right.
It's a possibility. It's there, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I went there last summer, and you can really experience, how it is to be in a country that is uncertain about its future. So we're the research, at least at this point, is looking at those different systems. How do they handle this new load, right? Education, food, even security, and thinking about the different ways that different types of relationships can be created between Jordanians and Syrians, seeing that we could actually see, those borders unravel, and if things continue in a certain way, we have to think about different forms of organization, even in terms of the state and socially. Actually, one of the northern cities, Mafra, is now a huge Syrian population has moved there, and according to numbers, the city, which was basically the poorest city, number 12, now became number 7.
Wow.
Because of this move, right? So we're trying to look at these things and sort of think about the different design projects that we can work on.
Interesting. So how do you see that project intersecting with your previous work with the Governance Design Lab, which was a project essentially organized and facilitated by Jake Dunnigan, obviously PhD from the Hawaii program, but also currently at the Institute for the Future. So could you talk a little bit about that project and what role you played in that, and sort of how that fits into sort of what maybe you see this Jordan project becoming?
Yes. So the project was the Unconstitutional Convention. I think that's what its name was. And it was very interesting. We had groups in different cities, I think about 10 cities, working on governance design projects. And you had people working on different things, new constitution, thinking about structures of cities. How does architecture play a role in governance? How to create new markets? You had different ideas being basically thought of and produced, and we basically had a day, right? So it was sort of a governance hackathon type experience. You had a lot of people coming in, taking those design briefs that were developed by groups that worked, that developed them basically the day before, and you take on those projects and try to build artifacts. And we had a few hours to do it, and it was fascinating. We had groups, from the university and outside coming in and working together, and it was interesting because you see citizens basically engaged in a governance design type exercise that tries to look into the future, right? So you're just basically sort of creating this not citizen who needs something that a designer can basically deliver, but somebody who's actually engaged in designing governance, sort of a new citizen, a different type of citizenry engagement, right?
Right.
So the Governance Lab, of course, is a program that was one event, and they're working on different things in different places. They're stationed, the IFTF is in Palo Alto in California, but they're working on projects, I think, around the globe.
Right. Yeah. The event was a global. I was actually facilitating the workshop in Myanmar, and unfortunately, we had an hour and 15 minutes, and we didn't have very good internet. So we did the best we could with what we had. But we had government officials, we had NGO people, we had youth, so it was an interesting experience. So Sandjar, with that sort of idea in mind, that obviously as a futurist, you need to think about global issues, and obviously with what Ali was saying, that we think critically about what's happening in Syria and how that affects Jordan. But how do you see that type of global perspective fitting into the conversations that you have with clients, right? I mean, I would imagine that the Syrian war doesn't come up too much if you're talking about developing a brand strategy for X client, but I would imagine it has to in other ways. So could you maybe talk a little bit how you sort of facilitate or sort of bring in a truly global perspectivism when you're dealing with maybe a regional or national or even international client who might not be interested in considering some of those broader questions?
Yeah, Syria never came up in our last design review. But, of course, it doesn't come up directly, but it does come up very much indirectly in the kind of world that we live in right now. Client after client after client will tell us that the world is more unpredictable than before. It's changing faster. well, we don't know what to do. Our customer base is fickle. They'll love us today, they'll hate us tomorrow. So the kinds of issues that the civic societies of the world are dealing with, businesses are dealing with as well. So the volatility of the world is definitely something that we're dealing with a lot. So one of the ways, of course, we try to alleviate that is for client work is to think about the user first, think about the customer need first, and then build your business strategy after that. And a lot of times for clients, it's not a very natural way to think. It's counterintuitive. So you would think that a business would care very much about what a customer wants, but because of the way organizations are built, because of the way the organizational kind of heartbeat, if you will, it moves a lot faster, let's say, or on a different wavelength than a customer. It just doesn't always work. I was in a conference just last week, hearing from the CMOs and the CEOs of big companies, and they're all talking about the same issue, which is how do you make sure that we stay focused on what our customers want? The global corporate history is fairly long. You'd think that they'd figure it out by now, but it's becoming more difficult. Competition is fiercer and fiercer, and then also the kind of the civil society that we're in is also in a way kind of outlived its useful life. So maybe the way citizens and businesses and governments interact with each other maybe are not very well suited to the type of world that we live in anymore. And that's definitely the challenge for designers and political leaders and futurists of the world to figure out in the next decade or so.
Right. Yeah, we're certainly in the midst of what Zia Sardar calls the post-normal age, right? How do we find a way to navigate a world where nothing seems normal anymore? So, okay, well, in an attempt to be somewhat normal, we are going to take a break. So this is Finding Our Futures. I'm John A. Sweeney. You're watching Think Tech Live. We're hearing really interesting things from Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh, both futurists, both designers. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a flash.
I'm Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with Think Tech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
With Ali and Sandjar, both futurists, both designers, both coming from different perspectives and yet bringing this synergy between the two to bear on their work and on their research. And as I mentioned before, Zia Sardar, who's a world-renowned futurist, researcher, academic, writer, sort of a jack of all trades, has this idea of the post-normal. And in the post-normal, we have a world filled with uncertainty. We're always on the precipice of chaos. Complexity is now the norm, even if it's post-normal, and the world is filled with contradictions. And actually, I talked a little bit about Zia, about the show and who I was going to talk to and what I was doing. And Zia is also known for his work on Islam. And what he said to me is that actually, from a lot of ways, Islam sort of took on the first and the earliest design challenge when they disallowed prophet or images of the prophet or of Allah. So in not allowing imagery, Islam had to find ways to design the kind of connections or the points of connection that religions use all the time, right? It had to develop an iconography without using an iconography. So I'm wondering if maybe you guys could talk a little bit, if at all, how Islam informs your work or how you see design and futures working out within Islamic context. Ali, let's start with you, and then we'll go over to Sandjar.
Very tough question. I actually don't know. to say the truth, Arabs generally are about 20% of the whole Muslim population around the world, and it's sort of I'm always thinking within that space, right? So of course we have a lot of problems that are also related to religion, but and you have to think through them. I'm a Palestinian, and they always throw religion, as if it is the Palestinian-Israeli problem. But generally speaking, I don't know how it ties into my work, but let me tell you something, sort of an emerging issue. A lot of Arab youth right now are very aware of sort of the unreligious components that are basically thrown into religion, right? So the role of the state, this sort of weird clergy group, right, that tries to present itself as they know all, right? They know the truth, they know the way. And you see a lot of Arab youth basically ignoring and sometimes opposing those people, and basically trying to connect with the people who are asking questions, right? Even for those really big scholars, those who are not willing to go with us through this journey of questioning, right? A lot of people tend now to ignore them. So I guess this is what I have to say.
Okay. Sandjar, over to you.
I agree. It is a very tough question. I come from a little bit of a different background of Islam, because I'm not an Arab. I come from Central Asia. I'm originally from Uzbekistan. And as part of when we were part of the Soviet Union, there was basically no religion to begin with. There's a lot of these traditions had to be conserved and concealed from the officials to really carry on to the next generation. So because of our parents and grandparents, we still have some of our identity. And then when we get independence, it was kind of a renaissance of our tradition, because a lot of the greatest Islamic scholars come from what is modern Uzbekistan, people like Bukhari and Fergani, people who really enlightened the world about the possibilities of peace and beauty and the poetry of Islam. But at the same time, the region that we come from, it neighbors Afghanistan, and kind of political and the religious instability has always been right next door. So I guess for me, growing up, it's always been a constant challenging conversation with myself, with my community, of how do you balance the kind of the religious freedoms and as well as the stuff that's going on in religiously and politically unstable places like Afghanistan, for decades now. So there's definitely a role that designers and futurists need to play in conflict-ridden zones like this. I don't think they are. I think most of the conversations are very politicized, very much removed from the needs of the people on the ground. So, but it remains to be seen how it will play out in the future.
Right. Okay, well, yeah, thank you guys for answering what I think was a completely unfair question. Part of the reason I asked it is I was at a conference and I was presenting this sort of new methodology I was working on, and everything is in threes, 3 circles, 3 this, 3 that, and a sort of well-known futurist came up to me afterwards and she said, what is this with you and the Trinity? This is a very sort of, like hyper-Christian thing. And I was like, no, it's not that at all. And the only explanation I come up with is I was raised Catholic and I couldn't help it. But like most good Catholics, sort of move down the road. Anyway, thank you guys both for chatting. It was very enlightening. Glad to see that there are designers and futurists out there trying to make the world a better place. So thanks to Sandjar Kozubaev and Ali H. Musleh, who are both designers and futurists. You've been watching Finding Our Futures. I am John A. Sweeney. This is Think Tech Live, and we will see you next week. Aloha.
Thank you.